Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. Some of the information you're going to hear today, in many ways, reinforces some of the ideas that we have talked about previously in the class, and even uses some of the same databases and information. Some of the information that we're going to go over is new. I do want to just reach out and say hello to you all. Wasn't really prepared to transition our class to online originally, but our format makes it fairly easy to do so. I want to remind you that there are a few remaining modules to complete in the class, and I can show you what it looks like. If you go into our course in Canvas, and that's not ours, so bear with me. If you go into our course, this is what you have already completed, weeks 1 through 8. There are now 4 remaining modules. Each module contains one discussion question based on additional resources that I've provided. The discussions have changed a bit in that there are no peer responses required. Students are encouraged to do this, but they are not required. And it's pass fail. So you turn it in, you pass. You don't turn it in, you don't get any points for that assignment. That's the same for the next 4 modules. You can work ahead. There are dates to guide you, but the course basically at this point is self-paced. So you can complete these as quickly as you would like, or you can take more time. That is absolutely up to you. The only thing that I haven't done is update the lectures in all 3 modules. So know that that is forthcoming, and I will try to get that done soon. Remember also that you can get in touch with me through email, through Messenger. If you send me an email, I can send you my number, and I am here. I am here to talk to. I am here to help. I've made questions formatted in a way that I think will help to engage you, but I'm here if you need me in all of these capacities, and you should expect to hear from me within 12 to 24 hours. If for some reason I can't get back to you or I have fallen ill, you can also contact my department chair, Dr. Eric Duke. His name and number are on, an email address rather, are on the revised syllabus here. Yes. No. Well, that has not been revised, so I will update that after we do this, and make sure you have all of that correct information. Thanks. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. Oh, goodness. Today we're really going to look at the anti-slavery movement. And the reason that we look at it this way instead of just talking about abolition is that the anti-slavery movement did encompass some groups that did not want an end to slavery legally. Rather, they wanted to amend it in some way. But we're going to spend some time looking at how enslavement really becomes much more widespread after the creation of the new republic following the American Revolution. We're also going to look at how free populations, free communities are also becoming larger at this moment in time from the 1790s through 1860. We're going to talk a number of we're going to use the point the 1860s. Again, that's where our class ends, but that's also the beginning of the American Civil War, of course, which is over slavery. So there are movements to end slavery even before the American Civil War begins, But slavery becomes, because it is legal, it is discussed throughout official documents and the construction of our country. You can make the case, as many scholars do and have, as the slavery becomes entrenched in America, meaning it becomes a fundamental aspect. Many of the nation's physical construction is done by those who are enslaved, not only in Washington, D.C., but also across the American South. In places like Georgia, for example, the University of Georgia is built with enslaved labor, the same about most state institutions and most of any buildings that would have been built. So the physical legacy of enslavement is actually all around us if we choose to remember it. As I said before, calls for abolition and the end of enslavement were very, very loud before the American Civil War and will continue so. We can look at the constant rebellions of enslaved peoples, both in the American South and across the Western Hemisphere, as or rather in a number of ways. We can see them as a tradition of rebellion that is going on in terms of race and class across the Western Hemisphere. We can certainly see, in the case of the United States, as these enslavement rebellions as a direct sort of opposite of what the Constitution stands for, and the cry for inclusion, and even a demanding of the same rights that are articulated in a constitution that does not protect all of its people. So we're going to look at a few of these these both slave rebellions and revolutions that are very much at a steady pace. In the first part of the course, we talked about, again, all of these other rebellions that go on in North America before it becomes the United States. And that rebelliousness very much continues in this part during the early republic. Another trend to keep in mind is that throughout this period, slave laws become increasingly more brutal over time. So if we look at the beginning of slave laws in what will become the United States around 1712, what we see is a direct increase in the physical brutality of enslavement as time goes on. So laws have by this point now prohibit manumission, which is the releasing of a servant or enslaved person from service. Laws are increasingly saying slaves obviously cannot own property. Slaves are forbidden to have firearms and weapons, forbidden to read, forbidden to learn of Christianity. And this is significant as we talked about in class, the majority of Americans who are becoming educated, even in terms of public school in the North, are doing so through reading the Bible and other religious documents, if you will. So by making education and Christianity illegal, it's also trying to sort of block the curriculum of education, as it were, in other parts of the United States. In 1810, there is an international ban on taking more enslaved Africans into the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S.'s willingness to break this law will lead the U.S. into another war with England. I make the point, I've made it in class and I'll make it again. The major wars before the Civil War, the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, are wars over enslavement. So the American Civil War is the third war that the United States fights over this issue. From the 1800s to 1860, the U.S. becomes wealthy based on its production of crops, specifically cotton. And with that, the locations for the wealthiest Americans are located in the American South. The U.S. is dependent on enslavement and enslavement labor for becoming wealthy. So the question of what to do as the US is gaining more states and it's getting bigger, and at the same time a an un you can't ignore this issue. It's leading us to a point of no return. So, a couple of things. I want to show you this, although we have talked about this before in class. So, looking at this, right? So, this is a population chart, and you have states in the United States. Obviously, over time, right, we're adding more states due to westward migration. So, the dates are significant because they start right after the Revolution and end right before the Civil War. I want us to pick this apart so you know what it means. The states highlighted in pink are slaveholding states. So at the beginning, this is Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. Just those states out instead of Kentucky, all bordering the Atlantic Ocean. As westward expansion goes on, right, you get the inclusion then of Tennessee, then eventually Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, moving on to Louisiana, right, after the Louisiana Purchase, Florida also, because Florida is going to be seceded to the U.S. by Spain. Texas, right? So 1850, this will be after the U.S. has a war with Mexico over enslavement in Texas. And then by 1860, all of these states. So what you're seeing within these graphs, right, are the free African American population. So in the North, right at the beginning of the new republic, you have about 27,000 free people who live there. What's the number in the South? 32,000. 10 years later, the population of free people in the North has doubled. It has also doubled in the South. That continues, right? So let's look at 1830. There are now more free people of color in the American South than in the free North. 1850, look at that. 228,000 versus 196,000. And right at the beginning of the Civil War, the number of free people in the South is higher than the number of free people in the North. Why does all of this matter? Well, I will certainly let you think about that on your own, right? But part of this is that history is about breaking down mythology. And there is a certain mythology about enslavement history that says that people were liberated from the top. I'm going to show you a narrative that is very much challenges that and shows you that these free communities were seen as a threat to the economic circumstances of the United States. These things are very much interconnected, you see. So let's talk about this. All right. Some of the earliest, obviously, support for abolition and the end of enslavement comes out of religion. So we've talked about the Great Awakening, and there's a second Great Awakening that's going to happen in the early 19th century as well. But from a religious standpoint, there were certain Christian denominations, such as the Quakers, that were pacifist and that would argue that in holding other people in slavery was not something that could be done by Christians. Over time, as we talked about before, there is a call for the end of enslavement right before the Revolution, very much using the same language that supported the American Revolution as justification for the end of enslavement. There was also the religious argument that God would certainly punish those white people who were engaged in this. And this is actually a common theme, even discussed among slaveholders and those engaging men who owned ships, white men who owned ships, who made a profit off of this, repeatedly saying that God will strike them down for putting profit over humanity. You see people writing about this in their journals. There's also certainly a call for the abolishment of slavery from free people. And again, as we've just seen, those numbers are increasingly larger over time. Um, there are states that emancipate, Pennsylvania being one. New York will outlaw slavery after the American Revolution as well. So some of those northern states outlaw enslavement in their individual states' constitutions, but the South doesn't. And again, what you see very much developing in the American South, a narrative that's often not discussed, is as the South becomes more industrial, urban, right? The majority of free people physically are going to live in urban areas. Enslavement is going to be much more widespread and commonplace in rural areas, oftentimes in counties where there is a landlord who owns most of the land and have at sometimes 200 to 250 enslaved people working it. So, one idea for the end of enslavement is done through what was known as gradual emancipation. There's the idea that America would end enslavement, but slowly over time. And this was popularized, of course, by a bunch of white men in the American Colonization Society. They are mostly slave holders, slave owners, many of them who often performed atrocious acts of violence on women and men, slaves. So they're slave owners, mostly from the American South, who want to take enslaved peoples back to Africa. There is support among this, among many religious groups and even political groups. You do have to question what their motivation is for doing this, as they're not talking about the sort of the moral aspects of this, but rather removal policies, right? So anyway, many of those who support the American Colonization Society will support the move to Liberia and other places, and they actually do take people to parts of Africa in the 19th century. Slave rebellions, as we've noted, occur across the Republic. In Virginia, in 1800, Prosser's Rebellion. There is also Denmark Vesey's rebellion that does not get underway, but his plans are found out in the conspiracy, in a conspiracy type issue, and he's executed. In 1811, one of the largest slave rebellions in American history in Louisiana. Many of those enslaved people who leading this were actually from Haiti and had experience in the Haitian Revolution. This also is going to take place along the Mississippi River, but it becomes one of the largest slave rebellions in American history. Denmark Vesey also attempts to lead this rebellion in Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion happens in 1830, and then 1859, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry. White men are involved, blacks are involved, women lead slave rebellions, women are involved in slave rebellions. So you really see not only a steady stream of these events, but a wide spectrum of participants who are engaging in slave rebellions, right? Taking up arms against white slave owners, killing local people in an attempt to go to a place to become free. With the Second Great Awakening, there is a call for immediate emancipation. And immediate emancipation is exactly what it sounds like, trying to end slavery now. And you might understand this too through the lens of the media. the media plays a very large role in trying to amplify this message, particularly newspapers. One white newspaper editor of an anti-slavery, or rather abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, is William Lloyd Garrison, whose picture is right here. His offices are attacked. He is brutally attacked as well. His life is threatened. He also hires Black authors and writers in his newspaper. He is wanted by people in the South who offer money if you bring him dead. So his newspaper very much becomes one of the critical organs for trying to disseminate the message. You have to ask yourself, if you are in the 1830s and you are trying to deliver the message to the rest of the nation about trying to end slavery, how do you do this? It's mostly done through organizations. It's done through certainly Christian organizations. But what are the tactics? Lecturing, pamphlets in newspapers, demonstrations, petitions, right? So these are some of the ways that people are trying to distribute. But remember, most Americans can't read. In the South, it's going to be very hard to get your hands on some of these documents as well. And so trying to get the message out of the horrors of slavery is much more complicated than we often try to even explore. And of course, there is a white supremacist reaction to saying that enslavement is wrong or bad or consequential, and that is mobs. Mobs of white people who are going to attack those. And this is an example. An abolitionist, right, of what you would see in places not only like the South, but also in other parts of America. This one reads, outrage. Fellow citizens, an abolitionist of the most revolting character is among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South. A seditious lecture is to be delivered this evening at 7 o'clock at Presbyterian Church in Cannon Street. So this is saying, let the rights of the states guaranteed by the Constitution be protected, the Union forever. Wow. So this gives you an idea as to how propaganda, even at the time, fake news, if you will, is used to try to present a counter message. And that is abolitionists are destroying the fabric of the country. All right. We've certainly spent some time looking at white abolitionists. Let's spend time looking mostly at Black abolitionists. For Black abolitionists, access to the white public was much more limited, certainly. So there's sort of a separate organizing function. You do see cooperation between Black abolitionists and newspapers. There are other separate Black abolitionist newspapers. But again, access to white audiences, white politicians, and those with real power is very much blocked by Black abolitionists, as well as the tactility of how you move around in a society that limits mobility, and in a society in which free people can also be kidnapped and forced into enslavement, which is the narrative of 13 Years a Slave, if you've seen that particular film. So let's look at Black women abolitionists, as this is something that you've already written about. If you remember from your assignment, this particular site really highlighted so many women who had done amazing things. Maria W. Stewart, in September of 1832, was a free woman of color, and she became the first woman, first American woman to address a public audience of women and men. Obviously, speaking out against slavery, but also criticizing Black men for not standing up and being heard on the subject of rights. She wrote for The Liberator. and was a sort of prominent voice in William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. Another Black woman, Mary Prince, wrote of her own experiences. This is a slave narrative autobiography which explored the horrors of what she went through in the Caribbean slave trade, and the first woman to present an anti-slavery petition to the British Parliament. We discussed Sarah Mapp Douglas, who was an abolitionist, writer, and educator, born of free parents in Philadelphia, and a founding member of a biracial abolitionist group called the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which is really interesting, as Black women and white women will not often be on the same side because of issues of women's suffrage and white women's own racism. There's also the Fortin women, generations of free Black women who are abolitionists, writers, contributors to the Liberator, and a example of multi-generational activism that sort of transcends the 19th century. We're more familiar with Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. If you haven't seen Harriet, this is certainly something to do, as Harriet Tubman is not only an abolitionist, but is a physical liberator, going into the American South vis-a-vis boats and using rivers to navigate to and physically free people and taking them up to northern routes along the Underground Railroad, which also certainly used water in order to do that. Tubman is the most famous name associated with this, and works with the Union Army as basically a ship captain. So we understand that Black women are critical to the abolitionist movement, and whose contributions are really undervalued. And need, certainly as everyone was discussing, and needs to be elevated. All right, that's what all we're going to look at in terms of the abolitionist movement today. I do want to bring your attention here very quickly, if I can. And if we go back to slave, oh, no, I can't. Oh, right. This is what I wanted to do. I want to, take a quick look at the topic for this week, which you can find here in Module 10. I found some really incredible maps of using ArcGIS software that is put together. And you will highlight a couple of these different pinpoints yourself and tell me what you think about it. So this is using ArcGIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. And this collection of data shows us specific places in Georgia where we see free populations as well as acts of resistance and rebellion. So I do want you to take some time and look at some of these sites, right? Perhaps you're familiar with Georgia. If not, you might, again, learn some new things. But Richmond, which is where Richmond County, which is where Augusta is currently today, was also the site of one of the largest free populations in Georgia. And as you can see, total population around 1860, which is right before the Civil War, is around 21,000. The white population is roughly 12,000, right? The average slave, there are about 8,000 slaves there in Richmond County. So it gives us a lot of very rich data, but we can also start to understand some of the specific ways that free communities organize themselves, what sort of jobs people had, and how they were able to retain freedom with this sort of larger enslavement going on around them. Churches remain, and as you can see, churches or will remain critical for education and also political conversations. And the birthplace of Morehouse College is also in this particular community. So in this discussion, I want you to just look at some of these, pick one of these sites or more to talk about, and tell me what are those data points and why you picked it. So I will continue to talk about and lecture on both westward migration, the Trail of Tears, the Mexican-American War, and some of the causes of the American Civil War that we're driving towards by 1860. Thank you, and I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and know I'm thinking about you.